What is up, everybody? It's Dr. Vibe here, host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe show, live streaming from Toronto, Ontario, Canada on May 5th. As always, I'd like to say you're blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles, and a solution for someone's problem. Know that this is the home of Epic Conversations. I'm the host of Epic Conversations, 2018 Innovation Award winner given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association, and co-host of monthly online conversations with fathers. They're online conversations via video with fathers, co-sponsored by Dad Central, Canada's national fatherhood organization, and Dove Men Care. I love doing research because when I do research, I find out great and interesting people, which I speak will become friends. And we have another new friend for the Dr. Vibe show. And I always like to get new friends. The more good friends, the better. And our new friend today is Johnathon Briggs. He's a 40-something father who favors wingtip shoes and statement socks. Man, I wonder if he's got seersucker suits too. He launched his blog, Fatherhood 40, back in 2017, a year after he was invited to speak at his college reunion about, quote, when life goes off script. A classmate inspired by his remarks pulled him aside and said, quote, if you had a blog, I would read it. Well, that's an easy persuasion. Fatherhood 40 chronicles Johnathon's journey throughout fatherhood, from date nights and dad bod to raising a child with special needs and musings about current events. He and his family live in the burbs of Chicago, the Windy City, but every winter he dreams of returning home to his state of California. His favorite hashtag is Black Dad Magic. Now, sorry to disappoint some people. We're not going to be talking about fatherhood today, but there's a part 2. We're going to talk about fatherhood. But today, he put out a great article on the Good Men Project, which I've been a featured contributor for the last, 7.5 years now on that site. And the article is called Existing While Black is a Pre-Existing Condition. So welcome for the first time, and hopefully not the last time, Mr. Johnathon Briggs. How are you today, sir?
I'm great, Dr. Vibe. How are you?
I am blessed, highly favored, a magnet for miracles,
Love
and
it.
a solution for someone's problem. That don't change. And it's great to have you here. I also want to shout out one of my great Canadian supporters, Luke from Windsor, Ontario. Welcome, Luke. Thank you for dropping in. Mr. Johnathon, I read a great bio about you, but there's got to be life before you and 40-something. Can you share with our audience a little bit about, it sounds like your life started in California.
Yeah, so I'm a native Californian. I grew up in Los Angeles, California, actually, and I ended up becoming a journalist. So when I was in high school, I didn't have a job. It was my senior year. I was on my way to college for the summer. My mother came home with a copy of a teen newspaper called LA Youth, and she threw it at me, and she said, "Make yourself useful." And
wow.
I opened up the newspaper, and there was an ad inside, and they were soliciting writers. They said, if you want to write for this teen newspaper for and by LA teens, come to our offices. So to escape my mother's nagging, I got on the bus, went to this office, and they put me to work right away. I ended up writing articles about all kinds of things, including at the time it was Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie.
Whoa!
And so I had set out to do an article about the movie, which had caused a lot of controversy at the time because Spike Lee said the movie was so important that parents should allow their kids to skip school.
I remember that.
Yeah, and so it just so happened that there was a Black journalist who couldn't go to the National Association of Black Journalists Convention in Detroit that summer. That's where Spike Lee was going to premiere Malcolm X. And so since he couldn't go, he said, why don't you take my plane ticket? Obviously, this is before 9/11. And, go to the conference and see if you can interview Spike Lee. So I went to Detroit.
Oh.
I was 17 years old. Yeah. I was chaperoned by another photojournalist by the name of Lester Sloane, who was a well-known photographer for Newsweek. And I didn't get a chance to interview Spike Lee directly, but I did get a chance to meet Oprah, I saw Rosa Parks. She was there at that particular convention. And I was able to attend the pre-screening of Malcolm X and include some quotes from Spike Lee in my article. But ever since that time, I was bitten, as they say, by the journalism bug. And I became a journalist. And so when I got back to California, I went to college that fall. I ended up majoring in communications and African American studies, and I became a journalist.
Wow. Wow. Some questions already, some conversation. Just a story, like how did you meet that famous photographer, and what memories do you have of being chaperoned by that gentleman?
Yeah, so Lester Sloane was a board member of LA Youth, the teen newspaper.
Okay.
The newspaper was founded by a woman named Donna Myro, who became my very first journalism mentor. So it was her idea for me to go to Detroit to what they call the NABJ convention. Yep. And he agreed to chaperone me. And, Lester, at the time, there was a national photography exhibition called Songs of My People, where photojournalists fanned out across the United States to photograph a day in the life of Black America. And yes. Lester contributed to that project. So Lester was fairly well known because of that, and also the great work he did for Newsweek. And I was able to learn from him during those, I think it was like 3 or 4 days. I was, guided around by him. He really pulled me aside and he encouraged me. He said, I really think you have a facility for writing. And I think you should look at this as not as a hobby, but as a career. It's something you could actually do. I'd never met any journalist. No one in my family was a journalist. No one in my family made a living by putting words in their proper place. So this was a foreign idea to me, but it stuck. And thanks to Donna, she really encouraged me, and she served as an advocate for me. She connected me to a lot of people, including people at the LA Times, which I later worked at the LA Times. She really set me on this path. I thought I was going to become a pediatrician, believe it or not. I had my sights set on going to medical school.
Yes.
But my life took this happy detour, and I found out that, medicine obviously is vitally important, especially as we're learning now in this age of COVID-19. But, the power of storytelling to help heal communities and to help frame narratives that can really affect people's lives is equally important. So I saw my work in a different way, not medicine, but narrative as a way to write about and heal communities.
We may not, we'll get to the main article. There's so much subject right there that I want to catch what we can in real time. First of all, what did your mother think about you pursuing journalism? Because you wanted to do the medical stuff. What did she want you to do?
Well, my mother, she's really great because she never pressured me to do one thing or the other career-wise. She wanted me to pursue what made me fulfilled, which is rare. And yep. So she didn't really know that I had wanted to become a pediatrician. It was something I had been inspired to think about by my biology teacher in high school. This woman named Lynn Icoma. It just so happens that she went to Stanford University. So when I got accepted into Stanford University, she encouraged me to pursue medicine because I had done so well in her classes. And I enjoyed medicine. I enjoyed the biological sciences. I think for my mom, she was just happy at the time that I got out of the house and I was in the cow. But, because I was the first one in my immediate family to go to college. And then at the time, Stanford was considered, I think it was the number 1 or number 2 college in the, I think it was ranked in the world, certainly in the US, it was number 1. I was more concerned about how to pay for Stanford because we didn't have money to pay tuition. It just so happens that, there's always a plan that you don't know about in terms of what, God or your higher power is planning for you. Sometimes your steps are ordered. And it just so happens that I got an academic scholarship that paid for 90% of my tuition. So
congratulations.
It would be meant for me to go to Stanford. Yeah. It wasn't meant for me to become a doctor, but certainly it was meant for me to be there and to have this detour, as I call it. It really wasn't a detour; it was the path all along.
Wow, that's phenomenal. Do you have still any of those early articles you wrote for that LA public?
I do.
No, yes.
I actually have a scrapbook. The very first article I wrote, this is going to sound ridiculous, but it was about it was about phone etiquette for teens. Because, when you're a teenager, you're trying to find a job. You have to, at that time, this was the 90s, you had to pick up the phone and actually call people. You want to sound polished and professional. So they asked me to write an article about phone etiquette.
Wow. Okay. Well, why the life in California, sunny, nice weather? Where did you go from California? Was it straight to Chicago?
So I graduated in 96. I ended up getting a job in Chicago. I had a 1-year fellowship with a publication called the Chicago Reporter, which at the time was run by a woman named Laura Washington. She was the editor and publisher. She was Harold Washington's press secretary. Harold Washington was the first Black mayor of Chicago.
Yeah.
Laura became a mentor to me as well, and I learned a lot about investigative journalism. The Chicago Reporter is focused on using investigative reporting to examine race and poverty issues. So I ended up writing a lot about HIV and AIDS in the Black community, and it just so happens that I wanted to travel abroad before I really started working full time, and while I was still able to not, move freely because I didn't have, wife and kids at the time. So I ended up leaving Chicago after that 1-year fellowship to go live and work in South Africa during Mandela's last year as president. It was his last official year as president. It was a program similar to the Peace Corps, except instead of doing 2 years, you can do 1 year. So I went to work as a volunteer journalist in South Africa, writing about poverty in South Africa and about the role of churches, the role that they could play in helping to combat what they consider the next big evil after apartheid, which is poverty. So I did that for a year, and then I came back to the States, back to LA to work for the LA Times. And then I ended up, the LA Times is part of the Tribune Publishing Company. Yep. They own papers across the country. So I ended up with they call it, it's a residency, a 2-year residency, 1 year at the LA Times, and then another year at one of their sister properties. And I ended up going to Baltimore, Maryland to work for the Baltimore Sun. And then I came back to Chicago. What was that? Probably 7 years later, in 2004, I came back permanently to work for the Chicago Tribune. So I kind of hopped around, journalism, you kind of move around. Part of it was I wanted to travel abroad. So I was blessed enough to raise money to go do that for a year. But then I came back and really started my career in journalism, which, I was a professional journalist for about 11 years.
Congratulations.
So that was before the 40-something stuff.
Yeah, but no, that's phenomenal story. I hope one day I hope you either have or plan to write a book.
Not really, not about my, not about my career. So Dr. Vibe, let me clarify this. I do want to write a memoir. I do want to write a book. My blog is actually my book in blog post form. Okay. So it's emerging through the blog. I have people tell me this all the time. They're like, you should write, you have a book in you. I don't think my professional story is particularly compelling or interesting. It's interesting.
Hold on. How do you know? You and I are both media people. You see some of the nonsense out there, or people watch. So where are you going with that? Now, don't sell yourself short.
No, it's not that I don't think it's interesting or compelling. I don't think it's interesting and compelling by itself. I think when I weave it together as part of a larger story that has a point of view, I think about Michelle Obama's book, Becoming. If you
Okay.
read her book, it's written as if it's a series of letters. And I
Okay.
think that's kind of how I see it, is that the my career is one theme or series of letters that's the backdrop to other themes that I'd want to explore. But I don't find that, I know a lot of, accomplished people. And so I think I've always been very humble to say that, it's not really about me so much as about maybe some of the things I've had a chance to write about and share. Because when you have access as a journalist, people are inviting you into their story. And I think there's something that needs to be, there's something very sacred about that.
Well, I'm ready to buy the book whenever it's
That's very kind of you.
no, and you are very humble, because if you go on your site and your blog, you don't really talk too much about that stuff.
I haven't gotten there yet because the book is, the blog is about me being a dad.
Yeah, but that's why, especially when I have friends come on for the first time, I think it's very important that they share some of their story.
Sure.
And I just find that even more fascinating individual to me than the brief time we spent online the other day and just reading about you. There's things beneath the ink, or the digital ink, that are very fascinating.
There's layers. I think we all have layers, right? I think you go through different stages and phases of your life. And I think by the time you get to your 40s, which they call your wisdom years, hopefully,
yes,
you're able to re-examine your life and really kind of put things in perspective. So, I appreciate the words of encouragement about the book. I will get to work on it. I think the book is playing out through the blog right now, and we'll see. We'll see.
Excellent. Well, let's talk about an article you wrote on the Good Men Project, and you contributed on a regular basis, and I have for the last 7+ years. Existing while Black is a pre-existing condition. Why did you decide to write this article at this time?
So I was, like most of the world, really, just completely overwhelmed by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of the magnitude of it. We haven't lived through a pandemic like this in our lifetime, right? Of a certain age. I think most of the people that survived the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, who are still around, they've seen this before. They're in their 80s. But for a lot of people, this is new to them. And, I'm a news person, I'm a media person. And as I'm absorbing all of this news and information on a very personal level of what does it mean for my family, what does it mean for my community, I started looking at the coverage. And the coverage was really, there was a lot of conversation about how the pandemic was affecting Americans. One of the things that came out of that conversation was Oprah decided that she was going to do a series of conversations about COVID called Oprah Talks COVID-19. Her very first episode was about COVID-19 and Black America. And one of the points that she talked about with Van Jones from CNN was about how the message of who was at risk for the pandemic, for coronavirus, was centered around pre-existing conditions, but that a lot of people don't think about chronic illnesses that they have as pre-existing conditions, right? Because that terminology is lost on people because it's very specific. It's very medical and clinical. So she started explaining, she asked Van Jones to explain, well, what is a pre-existing condition? And he had written a column about this on CNN, and so as they were having this conversation, I kept thinking, the pre-existing condition is not diabetes. It's not heart disease. It's not cancer. It's not asthma. The pre-existing condition is actually systemic racial inequality that puts Black people and really people on the margins at risk. And if you happen to be Black, that means that being Black in and of itself is a pre-existing condition because it puts you at risk for a lot of things that you should not be at risk for. Or I should say, it disproportionately puts you at risk for these things. So that's where the idea for the blog piece came from, was I wanted to unpack this idea of what do we mean when we say that something is a pre-existing condition, and kind of take it to a broader level and say, really, this is not about COVID-19. It's about what Jesse Jackson told the Associated Press. It's about the unfinished business of America. We have failed to truly live up to our promise, or our ideals when it comes to Black Americans, and that dates back to Reconstruction. So,
Right.
I'm not a trained historian. I mean, I studied history. I'm not a medical doctor, although I majored in public health. I'm just a father in America, looking at these conversations and saying, I want us to think deeper. I think, Dr. Bob, you say that, I think one of your taglines is something like aim higher, aim wider.
Aim bigger, aim higher, aim wider. Yeah.
And I wanted us to go bigger with our thinking about that conversation, because more and more data was coming out that state by state by state showing that Black Americans were, 50% of the cases and 70% of the deaths, and, only make up maybe 13% of the population. And, the figures were astonishing. And I wanted to really convey in a way, there's nothing wrong with us. We are not inherently flawed. We live in environments that put us at risk, and that really should be more equitable, and so it shifts the focus from individual decisions about you should eat better, you should exercise more, you should do all these things, and it takes it to a level that's really beyond individual control. It requires collective action, which is, what are we going to do to make our communities better and stronger? And those are policy questions, and those are probably questions for activists and other people, community level conversation. I wanted to just take that shift away from focusing on individuals.
Great. I just want to shout out on the Get Vocal platform, a great supporter of the Dr. Vibe show, and Dr. Vibe, Dr. Tachi hosts one of the best live streams about media, tech, and pop culture called Mediascope on every Wednesday, 5 p.m. Eastern time on, I always forget, Instagram Live, and then at 6 p.m. she's on Eastern time. She's on Facebook Live, Periscope, WJMS Radio, and LinkedIn Live. I hope I got all of them right. Dr. Tachi will tell me if I'm not correct or not, but great to have her here. And she says, yes, the conversations always lead to Black people being inherently flawed. Great point. I want to ask, and one of the many things about this article, I hope I can bring some of them out, because if we had all the opportunity to spend 2 hours, but one of the things you touch about pre-existing conditions, and I want you to elaborate that, because there's a line from your article that, but the true pre-existing condition fueling the high death toll of African Americans from COVID-19 is something less visible, just as real: structural violence. And I've very rarely heard pre-existing conditions aligned with structural violence.
Yeah, so the concept of structural violence goes back to this guy named Johann Goltong. I hope I'm saying his name right. He's still alive today. I believe he might be in his 70s or 80s. He's the founder of a peace institute. I believe it's in Norway. Don't quote me on that. But he and several theologians in the 60s really thought through social injustice and the role that theology could play in societal change. And I came across that concept when I was studying for my public health degree. And it always struck me, because this idea of structural violence, we would say now that it's systemic inequality, or if you're a public health person, you would say social determinants of health. That's another key kind of buzz term or buzzword. And really what you're saying is that the world as we know it, what we call reality, is shaped by institutions, right? There's the federal government, the state government, the local government. There's the Department of Commerce. There's the Department of Agriculture. There are laws. There are, bylaws that run your condo association, or, all of that. All of these things form the structure of our reality. And those things are inherently violent when they reduce the ability of a person to reach their full potential. So when you think about something that I quote Nicole Hannah-Jones from the 1619 Project, who actually won a Pulitzer Prize, by the way. Yesterday it was announced that she won a Pulitzer Prize for her commentary for that project. But I quote her as saying, she said, look, Black people are not inherently, at risk for diabetes and all these things. We live in communities that are, close to environmental, landfills, or close to highways, which means we are more at risk of developing asthma. You look at the patterns of housing, job opportunity, healthcare access, and the outcome, because of those larger forces, is you get people who are going to be more impacted by chronic illnesses or by certain diseases or conditions. And so that all of that is structural violence. It's the structure of our world that puts certain populations at risk more than others. And that's the real pre-existing condition, because those conditions existed before we even knew about coronavirus.
Absolutely. I'm doing some research for our conversation today, and I found something very interesting and enlightening, that 70% of African Americans live in 10 cities in the United States.
Right. We are concentrated.
Yeah. So all the ills of city life that afflict African Americans, they're 70% rounded up right there.
Right. Absolutely.
Just taking from that, Ms. Hannah-Jones saying that she told Oprah that America's man-made racial inequality is driving the disparity of the COVID-19 deaths. So definitely very much agreed. I'd like you to also provide your historical perspective of this situation when it comes to African Americans.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I have a lot of interesting friends on Facebook, and some of them are in public health. Some of them have worked in government. Some of them, have worked in private industry, corporate America. One of them happens to be former health commissioner, assistant health commissioner here in Chicago, and was a regional commissioner for the state health department. And he had shared a piece that actually was published in the American Journal of Public Health in April, where there's a historian who has been looking at the historical health policies that have created this big health disparity for African Americans. And in that piece, this gentleman, whose name actually escapes me right now, you may have it from the blog post, but he describes how a lot of this conversation about African Americans being, disproportionately impacted by all these diseases and whatnot is not something that is, recent in terms of the last few decades. This has been a centuries-long conversation about, our health status in the country. And what he documents as a historian is a lot of what you could call structural violence from the 1800s, so after Reconstruction, the 1900s as well, that shows that it's not just that we were living in overcrowded conditions that puts you at risk for a lot of health issues, but we were denied economic opportunity. Some doctors didn't even think it was worth educating African Americans because they didn't have the capacity to understand health and disease. So you look at these forces over time, and you see that it's not just the structure of things, but those structures play out in individual interactions. There have been numerous studies that have shown that African Americans have a distrust of medical establishment because of the way they've been treated. Sometimes that's been experimentation that has happened against our will. We were not aware we were being experimented on, or just really negative encounters where our symptoms were not taken seriously compared to our white counterparts or to someone, another group. And so you end up with the legacy of this distrust coupled with policies where we're basically, it's like we weren't even viewed as human. And I think that's really at the heart. If we go deeper and deeper, you know, we have to start thinking about humanity as all of humanity. You know, I think I had written a blog post, a few posts before this one, where I quote Martin Luther King, who says, we will either learn to live together in harmony or perish together as fools. We cannot, you know, sort of separate ourselves from each other. We are part of one fabric of humanity, which might sound very, you know, kumbaya, but it's the truth. And our policies and practices don't reflect that reality, right? We still have people who are basically discriminated against in healthcare or don't have access to certain, you know, medical interventions, et cetera. So I think we just need to, you know, acknowledge that and then think about the solutions. You know, I don't want it to all be gloom and doom. There are individual and community level and some institutional initiatives that are happening to try to address these things. But those are recent compared to centuries of mistreatment and not being thought of as being part of the fabric of humanity.
Yes, I believe the gentleman that you were mentioning in regards to the study, his name is Joseph Harrington.
Yes. So Joseph Harrington posted the excerpt from the American Journal of Public Health that was written by the historian.
Okay, good. We'll go down. This is an American historical. This was going on for years. Like this is no big surprise. It's just that has COVID-19 just brought it to the forefront, really in our faces, something that's really been sort of like around us, but it's really in our face now.
Yeah, I think COVID-19 has really exposed the social inequity that's always been there. The, you know, social disparity, the health disparities, and it's not just, you know, obviously people of color, but you think about everybody who's on the margins of society. Think about people who are homeless. Think about people who are have different immigrant statuses. You know, we have to reckon with the fact that we are all here on this continent together, and more broadly on this planet together, and more broadly in this universe together. And we just have to do better. You know, one of my favorite bloggers is a woman. She goes by Awesomely Lovey, Lovey Ijaya Jones. And she wrote a book. I think it was a New York Times. Yeah, it was a New York Times bestseller a couple of years ago. It's called I'm Judging You, the Do Better Manual. Hey. And what he's judging people on is not to be, you know, side eye and just cut people down, but judging people on things that matter, like how we treat one another, and really making the case through humor, because she's a humorist, that we got to do better, people. And I think that's what COVID-19 has revealed. We got to do better. You know, we just have to do better.
But then my question to you would be, is America ready to do better?
Well, you know, I think, again, not to quote, I think it was King. He's one of my favorites. The time is right. The time is always right to do what is right. Okay. So I think there's never a perfect time. It's the time that you decide. And I think there are movements clearly throughout history that have, you know, forced those changes or have been working to make those changes. Certainly, I think that if you're talking about politically, is America ready? Then the question is no. We haven't even had our response to the epidemic really step up to the greatness that America really is. It's actually been quite piss poor. And that is not even something that is debatable. It's just the reality. And we still have time to get our response better, especially around testing, because we're going to need a lot more testing to make people feel comfortable to shop again, live again, work again, all of that. In terms of a larger conversation about, you know, integrating America's most vulnerable populations and people into the fabric, that's a never-ending journey, battle, struggle, etc. And we have organizations that have been working for decades, some of them for more than a century, trying to help America resolve its racial, quote unquote, racial problem. So I think, we as Americans all have a role to play. And certainly you look at, politically, this is an election year at the federal level in terms of presidential elections. People will have to make up their minds about what kind of leadership is needed to make the country strong again. Because right now it's not as strong as it could be.
I just want to expand. You had mentioned the Jesse Jackson quote from your article, and I want to read the whole paragraph and have you elaborate on the comments that Reverend Jackson made. But pulling from your article, it says, speaking on the racial toll of the virus, civil rights activist Reverend Jesse Jackson summed it up this way to the Associated Press, quote, "It's America's unfinished business. We're free, but we're not equal. There's a reality check that has been brought by the coronavirus that exposes the weakness and the opportunity." When you read that quote the first time by Reverend Jackson, what were your thoughts?
Well, I thought he was exactly right. There is certainly an opportunity for us to learn from this pandemic to really address some of the societal inequities that exist, that have Black Americans, or really enslaved Africans, were brought to America. And that is an unfinished conversation. And it's interesting because COVID-19 is not the first disease that exposes these kinds of disparities. I used to work for a nonprofit for 6 years here in Chicago called the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. And, you saw the same thing play out with HIV, the HIV epidemic, where, African Americans were always disproportionately impacted by the virus, the disease. People on the margins, for example, injection drug users. There was a whole stigma around if you were a substance user, how people viewed you. And that's regardless if you were Black or white. The fact that you injected drugs, people didn't want to have anything to do with you. And we had a hard time getting needle exchange programs here in Chicago, mainly because at a federal level, you cannot use federal money to fund needle exchange programs. So again, that's a form of structural violence that is causing people to die unnecessarily. They cannot live up to their potential because we will not fund an intervention that's been proven to be effective in extending their lives. But fortunately in Chicago, and really in Illinois, the AIDS Foundation was able to get policy legislation passed that allowed for needle exchange programs to happen in the state, as long as they were done under this umbrella of being research. And so we were able to see a reduction in HIV transmission because of that intervention. And so I think that's what I mean when I say there are always people working to attack this structural problem with structural solutions, but it takes time. It took the AIDS Foundation, and again, don't quote me on this, but I know it took years. I want to say it took, 7 years or so to get that legislation passed, because they were concerned about all people who were affected by HIV, not just some people, not just, people of a certain class, privilege, or race. And I think if we expand that out to other, situations like, for example, coronavirus, we need to be thinking about how do we reimagine a different kind of society, a different kind of community. Certainly, you look at the issue of childcare. We have people that cannot go back to work because the schools are closed and they can't afford childcare. And the ability to access and pay for childcare is something that hinders many parents, and especially single parents. So these are things that I think, to go back to Reverend Jackson's quote, they've been there. The coronavirus has exposed the need for us to truly reconcile. How do we uplift everyone? There's enough pie to go around. We don't have to fight over crumbs. We've just spent billions bailing out major corporations Yet we have small businesses that are struggling to get loans. They've had to go bankrupt.
Mhm.
So, it's this, to me, this is why I go back to Johan Galtung, the gentleman I mentioned earlier. This starts to become a moral question. It's not just political will. I think these are questions about our values and our morals, what we truly believe, and how do we really live them? If we say that we believe in these values that make America great, then those values should be applied to everyone, and we should be working to uplift everyone.
From a health care perspective and African Americans, obviously the biggest minority that's being afflicted by death by coronavirus is Black Americans. But what does that tell us about the state of the health system in America when it comes to Black Americans?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And I think just from, my public health experience, I mean, we know that there's work to do around engaging, because it's not just the health system, it's really, we start talking about health and wellness. And there have been study after study that have shown that being Black in America, and really being a person of color, so really racial minorities, but there's been a lot of work done on Black people, it's inherently stressful. So these things, yes, we know individually what you eat at an individual level, you can influence that to some extent. But if you don't live in a community that has any green space for you to go for a walk or exercise, or there are no sidewalks, so you can't jog, you have to drive everywhere. The nearest grocery store is 5 miles away. You have to take public transportation to get there. There are so many community level barriers to health and wellness that need to be addressed. In terms of the healthcare system, there are initiatives to really try to, get more Black doctors,
Yep.
Get applicants into medical schools so they can become doctors, get those doctors to practice in what they call underserved areas. So communities that don't have a lot of family physicians or family care doctors. There are, efforts that are supported, for example, by the American Medical Association, which is the largest physician-led medical body in the nation. So I think the efforts are there, and I certainly, in my article, I'm not pointing to solutions. I think really what it says is that there's work that needs to be done. And the reason I ended my piece the way that I did, with going back to what people are doing on an individual and community level by talking about that Mask Up and Live project, is that I never want people to feel hopeless. You can be aware of the structural forces and systemic issues that curtail your life or affect your life. But you are not powerless. You can do something about it in your own way. The way I think about it is that there are things within your sphere of concern, and then there are things within your sphere of influence. Obviously, you want your sphere of influence to grow big enough where it starts to really overlap with your sphere of concern. But you can start somewhere. And that's why I like that Mask Up and Live project, because they had a goal of getting 1 million masks into underserved communities, which in Chicago means the South and West sides. Mm-hmm. And, I don't think some people thought it could have been done, but sure enough, they did it. They got a major donation from one of the former political candidates for mayor, or mayoral candidates, Willie Wilson. His, foundation, or, he reached into his own pocket to make that possible, to get those masks out into communities. These are not the medical grade masks. I believe these were mainly the cloth masks that, being recommended. I don't know if there were, more of the PPE that medical folks need included in that. But the point is, we have resources and people and advocates within our own community that can help with, some of this work. Obviously, it's going to take the nation as a whole through its policies to really have massive population level change.
Yeah. I regard this when I share about this current time we're going through. This is a generational event because
Right.
everybody in the world is being affected directly or indirectly by this situation, and things are never going to be the same. What what tangible things would you suggest to Black Americans in regards to changing the course that's they're on right now? Many of them. What tangible things would you want to suggest to them in regards to getting started to change?
Well, I don't think it's really up to us alone. I mean, I think these are.
I agree, but I don't. I think there's things we have to do. We can't just sit back and wait.
Yeah, I hear what you're getting at. So I think in terms of things that are with our sphere of influence, and this is going to probably sound uh, basic, but we need to vote, right? And so I had a blog post where I said something like, we need to vote it as if our lives depend on it, because they do. And so if there's leadership that has ideology and beliefs that will not serve you and the African American community well, vote them out or vote for the candidate that will act in your own interest. And I think the level of engagement of African Americans, you can see it on the state level. There have been elections where particularly Black women have really helped, I would say probably either the better candidate or the lesser of two evil candidates, you know, make it to victory. So I think, never underestimate that particularly is for the younger generation. I think the older generation gets it because they've lived long enough to see how progress happens through these kind of incremental changes versus radical changes. But the young people may be disenchanted. But if they're voting age, they need to vote. And I think your point about this being a generational event is well taken, because we all know or will know someone who has either survived COVID-19 or died from COVID-19. And I think that personal connection is going to cause us to act differently about our role when it comes to voting and even community level leadership, stepping up to fill in these voids. Obviously, I think another thing we can do is really start to support organizations and initiatives that need support, whether that's volunteer support or money, to continue to do good work. So whether that's working with, if there's organizations that work with families of the incarcerated, if it's working with educational programs. We know that our kids are going to be out of school for a long time. It's a major disruption. Supporting, I know here in Chicago, there's an organization called Urban Prep Academies. They focus on increasing the graduation rates for African American boys. I got an email solicitation from them about how to support them during this time. So I think if you have the resources and means, support the organizations doing the work that we know will be needed for the future. Another thing is we have food deserts here in Chicago. So these are communities that don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables because there's no grocery store. And there are organizations working to fill in those gaps as well. So I think it's just start where you can and do what you can. Obviously, the role of churches is huge. Churches play a big role in the Black community. And I think our churches have, a lot of them, especially in Chicago, have been doing really great work. But obviously, if we have, pastors saying, come and gather when we should not be gathering, that is not a good thing. But then thinking about how do we use the power of our faith and of the community of a faith community to really move forward in health and wellness. I would say the last thing I would say is I majored in public health because at heart, I'm an advocate. I'm an activist kind of person. And so I don't underestimate the power of community organizing. Obama made his whole career out of community organizing, community mobilization. I think we as people in communities have to take our power back and say, this is what we're going to do. And this is what's important to us.
Okay. I fully agree with that. One of the things as we start winding out here that I always get concerned about is the way just a general statement, Black people and health, taking care of themselves, not only just physically, but emotionally. I think this situation has really amplified what's
Mm.
going on in a lot of America, that in a lot of African Americans have been left behind. And and
Yeah.
and sometimes they're not treating themselves the best food wise, health wise, and even reaching out for help. But then a lot of times the health facilities aren't there to serve them.
Yeah, it's interesting because in public health, there's always this riddle of public health of how come when people know better, they don't do better,
Mm,
and they don't always do better. And that's for anybody. It's not just if you're poor, if you're rich, etc. Behavior change is hard. It's hard to change a behavior. But I think on another level, there's this idea of what they call self-efficacy, which I always think of as like the ability to really advocate for yourself and to really sort of impose your preferences on what you need, right? And the truth is, a lot of people are just trying to survive.
yeah, yeah,
They don't have the time to stop and think and have some great insight or epiphany about what is going on with their life, about why they do what they do, right? They are on a default setting of, I need to eat, I have to take care of the kids, I have to do these things. And there's no time to stop and think. Time is a luxury. Time is a privilege. Time to think about your life and to, have conversations, they go deeper into how am I trying to live with intention? That requires a certain level of having your basic needs met,
yes,
and having the time to then process what's going on. And so I think, I'm not saying that people can't get there, or certainly they can, but I think we have to think about where people are,
right,
and then meet them where they are. Some people are further along in their awareness about what is happening around them versus what they are doing to themselves. And these two things play off of each other. Your environment influences your behavior can influence your environment. So, these things are always interacting with each other. And the reality is that you mentioned earlier that something like 70% of African Americans live in 10 cities. There's a lot of variation in the Black experience. Some of us are doing well off, and we try to help the ones that are not doing so well off. Others are not doing well. And, they are in situations that require more than individual behavior change. They require systemic change to how our society is organized and how we value what's really important.
yeah. Well, before we let you go, there were some things that you said at the beginning of our conversation, or one thing you said, another thing I want to ask you about. Love how you said journalism is putting words in their proper place. That I thought was very powerful. Is that something that was shared to you, or is that a Jonathanism?
It was actually shared with me. I believe I remember. So one of my former Chicago Tribune colleagues, Lolly Bowen, she's been at the paper now, I think probably 10 years. She wrote that. I think it was on one of her Facebook posts. And I had commented on it. It resonated with me because, there's not that many Black journalists in general compared to our white counterparts. So a lot of us we didn't grow up with journalists in our family.
Right.
And I think our family members would think about journalism kind of in that way. It's like, oh, you make a living putting words on this page. And I just like the poetic way that Lolly said it, because I think that's really true, right? We have to organize it in a way where people can understand it. And hopefully it makes an impact on them that makes them want to take an action or think a little differently.
And also, where do you get your great memory from? You remember people, places, names. I'm going, this guy's good. Like, I don't need my i5 desktop. I just
No, that's a what would I call it? It's a professional defect of being a reporter. You just remember stuff.
all right.
When you care about people, you just remember your interactions with them.
Right. And
I will remember this conversation.
One final thing I want to ask is, what has been the reaction to your article?
I haven't gotten any comments directly, but I have gotten the article was shared from, I can see track the number of shares from my blog post. One of the comments I did get on Instagram was from a friend of mine. We used to work together at the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. She said it was a very powerful and thought-provoking piece. And, you know, I am not an expert on a whole lot of things. I just have some insights that I think I'd like to share. And I think the piece, from her reaction, the piece achieved what I hoped it would, which was just to get people to stop and think about this language around Black people in the coronavirus and get us thinking about who do we want to be after COVID-19? You know, we're surviving it now and we're trying to figure out who we are during it. But after, you know, what's going to really happen? And I hope that we can come out better and stronger, and, you know, time will tell.
Absolutely. Well, Johnathon, I'd like to say thank you for taking time out of your positive, productive schedule to share with us this afternoon. If people want to find out more about you, where can they go?
Go to fatherhood@40.net. You can also find me on Twitter at Fatherhood40 and on Instagram at Fatherhood_AT_4.
Wonderful. Well,
I enjoyed the
Johnathon
conversation.
Yeah, and he's going to be back. We're going to talk about the Fatherhood 40 on a separate conversation. I would just like to thank a number of people who helped make this an epic conversation. Luke, of course, from Windsor. Of course, Dr. Tachi, much thanks. Donald, much thanks. I'd like to thank everyone who watched this live or on the replay or listened to it live or on the replay. I am Dr. Vibe. I'm host and producer of the award-winning Dr. Vibe Show, 2018 award winner in the innovation category given out by the Canadian Ethnic Media Association. I'm also co-host of monthly online live conversations, video-wise, with in collaboration with Dad Central Canada's National Fatherhood Organization and Dove Men Care, where we have conversations about fathers. That's what we do. As always, if you want to find out more about me, the best place to go to is my website, drvibeshow.com. And as always, I finish off with, live your life as a dream. If you can dream it, you can make it. Sometimes you have to get smaller to get stronger. Block assumptions and then aim bigger, aim better, aim higher, aim wider. Johnathon, thank you so much. Look forward to having you back and making sure that your family is safe and walks good.
Thank you. Same to you. I appreciated the conversation.
Looking forward to more. Thank you so much.
All right.